Okay, great. Hello, my name is Olek, and I came from Poland. I work for, as I mentioned in this video, for Samsung R&D Center in Poland. And what I'm doing, I'm a test automation engineer for telecommunication infrastructure systems that we are creating. So the examples that I will show here relate somehow to the domain we are using, but I hope you can relate it to what you are doing at your job. So it's taken from telecom industry, but I think you may find it useful, as I mentioned before. So by the name of this presentation, which is a little bit too long, you may guess that I'm not a very creative person and I couldn't come up with anything catchy here, right? Some very fancy title. But I hope it will be informative, right? Not interesting, but useful. Okay, so let's start. And so, what we'll talk about. First, I'll try to introduce the original problem that actually was the driver to use the Jenkins Job DSL in my project. And then I'll describe how this Jenkins Job DSL helped to solve the problem that I will introduce. And in the end, we'll summarize it somehow, right? So and first, before we start, before I explain like how Jenkins DSL can be used, I'd like to introduce the problem that we were trying to solve because it will make it easier to understand why some bits and pieces are there in this solution. Uh, I hope you all worked with Jenkins. You know what the tool is and how to use it, right? Because I suppose like some basic understanding of the tool. And so our original task was, as I said, I work for telecom industry. It's a part of telecom uh, system hardware connected together, and at some point in time, probably it's similar for all the projects. So new code is being released or just pushed to the repository. Then we need to install this code on our hardware here and run some set of very simple smoke tests to verify everything is okay, right? Then we take the verdict from this test and send it somewhere to the cloud to some server, right? It's very simple task. And of course, like the solution for this task automation was to use some simple Jenkins job, right? What it does, it's actually execute some script against the testbed that we had here. Everybody can do this, and basically we could consider the job done, but the issue with that was the test cases themselves, as I said, were really simple, nothing fancy, but they had to examine different data sets, right? What I mean, like different data were, I will call this like data set configurations. Different data sets had to be applied to this same set of test cases, right? So, for example, we needed to test, like to execute the smoke test with configuration 1, set some verdict. With configuration 2, it may be failed, right? So it's red. And up to n configurations that we had to run basically the same set of test cases with multiple sets of data. So you may call it kind of data-driven test, another verdict for data n, right? So what did we do to solve this complexity, right? So this data-driven stuff. First, we just copied the original job, right? And you probably all know how to do this. You just use this copy job feature in Jenkins, and we modified some internal parameters to make it work, right, for a different data set. So we ended up with at some point 10 or 15 jobs which were similar. Basically, they were identical, a part of some data that we entered to these jobs. Here I put some names for these jobs to differentiate them, like they have like 3 parameters: parameter 1 value, parameter 2 value, and 3 value, so you can see what's the difference between what the jobs do, right? And what could have possibly go wrong? So it appeared that in our environment, in what we had to do, there were like about 3 parameters that define the data set that we had to apply to our testbed, right? And each parameter, it can take about 4 valid values, right? So just by doing simple math, you can figure out that if 90% of possible configurations of these parameters are equally important to test, so we cannot just skip them, right? All this stuff is important and it should work. It would give us like 60 different combinations that we had to verify, right? And you would need to copy the same job like 60 times, putting the proper parameters there, not forgetting to change stuff as it goes, right? So, moreover, if we use a different testbed, right, slightly different hardware, we need to like double the number of jobs, right? We want to run the same test cases, like for example, with different base station type. So instead of 60 jobs, now we have 120 jobs, and it actually becomes unmanageable, right? So what were the drawbacks of this solution? So it was really hard to do the copying of jobs. Like you do copy, you need to remember to change like the data inside, so you take the proper like data file or something. And if you want to introduce some additional parameter or change some steps in your job, right, or expand something, you would need to click in 60 jobs, changing all these 60 jobs. It was really not pleasant, right? And for example, what happened, I know it's an extreme case, but if your Jenkins host fails for some reason, or like for example your disk drive fails, whatever, anything can happen, right? So it's a huge effort to recover everything, right? And it's in a nutshell, it's a maintenance nightmare, right? So we were looking for the solution for this problem, and first idea was just to use the multi-job step with parameters. What do I mean by that? So just create a parameterized template job that does the work, but by using some parameters, selects the data set that is being applied to the testbed, right? And then create a multi-job project and actually add this job as a job step in multi-job phase, right? So you would apply some job alias, job name, right, to differentiate these jobs when they are executed as part of multi-job. You want to continue the running of these jobs if the failure for one configuration occurs, right? You don't want to stop on first failure. And put here the parameters that later on will be used to select your dataset, right? And basically it worked. This was the final configuration, so we decreased the number of jobs significantly. Instead of 60 jobs, there were only like 2 jobs: smoke test template job and the multi-job. And this is how it looked like, more or less, right? And are we there yet, right? We are not. And why? Let's try to execute all these jobs. Let's say this is our execution result, and we see that there are some configurations that actually failed. Let's navigate to the first failure right here. What do we see there? So basically, because it's a template job, so it's just the job shared between different configurations, you can see that the build history actually is not informative. You don't know if this failure is the failure we are trying to investigate at this moment, right? There are like two different failures. Which one is our desired configuration, right? How to debug this, right? Moreover, you have this execution trend. You don't know if it's the same configuration failing over the time, over and over, right? Or different configurations are failing really hard to figure out, like to follow the trend. Of course, it's possible, right? If you are really experienced with this, you may figure out it in a fairly good amount of time, but still, it's really not debugger friendly, right? So, moreover, let's say we have the issue with some parameters where some parameters are not submitted properly. We want to update them, right? So this is basically the view you've got when you try to modify the configuration for a particular job step here. How do you differentiate between different job steps? For example, we need to update this one. So you need to click 60 times if you are unlucky, maybe 20 if you are more lucky, to figure out where this stuff is. Moreover, if you are the one who maintains this, it may be less painful. But for example, if these like testing activities are shared between multiple people, it may be really hard to figure out what to do. Moreover, if you want to rerun the failing configuration, right, it's really extremely painful because you need to understand what each parameter means, right? Here I use like discrete parameters and maybe it's not that obvious, but for example, you are using some separate data per each job which are not like a list, right? So you cannot choose between them. You just need to know what should be there. So how to run the failing configuration, really tough challenge, right? So in a nutshell, it's a debugging nightmare, right? If you are not familiar with the structure, you cannot do it properly. So what could help us? Or who, right? And basically it appeared, I hope you recognize the logo, right? And it's not copyrighted or something. It's for education purposes anyway, so I don't think they mind. Basically, some brilliant guys from Netflix, from their DevOps department, they also had similar issues when they needed to configure, at least they said like several thousands of similar jobs, and they came out with something called Jenkins Job DSL plugin, right? So originally they created it, but now you can also contribute if you want to, right? What is Jenkins Job DSL plugin? I'll just cite the definition or maybe description from Jenkins Job DSL wiki, right? This plugin allows the programmatic creation of projects using a DSL, and pushing job creation into a script allows you to automate and standardize your Jenkins installation unlike anything possible before. Before it was written like 2014, I guess, so before, maybe not the correct wording here. But now I'll show you how we were able to solve our issue using Jenkins Job DSL, and maybe you can relate it to something you need to do. So first, the installation part. It's really simple. Like you just go to a plugin manager, you type Job DSL here. It's one of two that appear, and you select it. You may install it without restart. It should work. I never restarted it. Oh, no signal. It's amazing. Is it my fault or? Okay, great. At least someone to blame. Yeah, okay, great. We're moving forward. And what we start from, we will create so-called seed job. What is seed job? Seed job is a job that will generate other jobs for you, right? How do you create it? It's actually a freestyle project, nothing fancy here. For our example job, I'll just call it first job seed, whatever. And when you create this job, what you need to do, you need to select process job DSL in your build step, right? And then you have two choices. Use the provided DSL script or look on file system. Of course, when you already created and tested your scripts, you probably will be using look on file system and take the scripts probably from your SCM, right? But for demonstration purposes, we will do the provided DSL scripts. So for development purposes, when you like testing your DSL, testing your program, right, your generator, you probably want to start with this one. And as you can see, it's just simple groovy script with job name, and for first example I just added one single step which greets you, right? And after you execute the seed job, this is what you've got, right? After the job is executed, the, let's say, normal Jenkins job that you defined is generated. And in your seed job, you will have a link to all the jobs that were generated by this seed job, right? In our case, it's DSL first job, and if you navigate by this link, we'll go to our DSL first job, which also contains the link to the job it was generated from. Really easy to navigate and really helpful, right? And inside this job, this is what we've got. It's just one shell step, right? Because I defined this as shell, and it echoes something, right? So let's move forward. As I mentioned before, there are parameters in our jobs, right? So, and this is the reason we are trying to use our DSL. So what we do, our first job, it's pretty much similar to what we done manually, but here we do it using the DSL. We define the parameters. As you can see here, parameters type may be different, like string parameters, or if you don't want to pass the values by parameters, you may use environment variables, and the step here. And we have another job which differs from the previous one only by the values of some parameters, right? And we create like 60 definitions like that, generate them. This is more or less what we've got. This is our parameterized seed job, and the list of all the jobs that it generated eventually, right? Let's look of what is being generated by our generator. So this is our code, and this is our GUI for job configuration. So you have a string parameter here, text parameter, multi-line parameter here. I didn't add any list parameter, but it's also possible. And for environment variables, there is a section properties content. It's defined there. And of course, this step, right, that we already looked at. So as you may notice, in our jobs, we have a repeating steps, namely here and there. So we do some do not repeat yourself stuff and try to improve it. Okay, so we don't want these steps to be copied over and over to all the jobs, because like basically we will end up with something we wanted to avoid, right? So you need to update this step. So you need to update 60 jobs or 100 jobs, whatever. We will make it better. So how do we do this? We use the concept called template job, right? The template job is the regular job that you define, right? So it contains the same steps and that you would add to your regular job, right? But it may be used by the other job to define like the template for it, right? And your, let's call it child job, will just add the parameters specific to this child job, right? But all the main steps will be taken from the template job, right? I will explain some details of this template job a little bit later. So let's look now what is generated by the seed job if we use this structure. So this is how you say that your child job is actually reusing some other job. So after job is generated, this is your seed job log, and it says, right, I generated this one and the template was the other job, right? And also in your child job, you have two links now, right? First is to your seed job and also to your template job. It allows you to modify stuff easier and to follow like the links between these jobs. More pleasant development, right? So, and now let's look at what was generated for each of the jobs. First, here you can see this is your GUI for your child job, and this is the definition for your template job. So it's not like your child job inside refers somehow to this template job. No, like everything is generated separately for each job. Every job is independent, right? Unless you don't want it to be. And here, what we have, first, we can define SCM, right? For this project, I use Git, but also other SCMs are also supported for Jenkins Job DSL. I mean, Perforce or something. Basically, everything that can be done manually by clicking can be defined in this code, right? So you can see that we specified the parameters for our SCM. And also, I decided to, to make our steps more complex. I added virtual environment, and please pay attention, it uses Python 2.7, and also the parameters for these build step are defined in my DSL, like this flag, nature, and command, right? Command that will be executed. So let's bring it all together. When we generated 60 jobs that satisfy our needs, right? They will select some proper data and execute test cases that we want to. We also want to run them, in one bulk, right? And we will actually reuse the concept I introduced earlier, multi-job, which is actually the container for other jobs, okay? And it will just serve as the single point of reference to all these jobs, right? Single runner. Also, I don't want to click it manually because it's really unpleasant and error prone. What I do, I will just generate this multi-job using Jenkins DSL. So here I define the job names that I want to be controlled by my multi-job as the Groovy list, but you can use other data structures, or you may, I don't know, use some Groovy libraries to download this information from some configuration files, right? And here you can see that it's a multi-job with its name with some parameters. Here inside you may find out like I didn't put all these jobs one by one to my DSL, right? To my code. I just use the loop over Groovy list to generate same steps all over again to make life easier and to make it more readable, right? So also you may find out that all the Groovy language syntaxes is valid in this script, right? So what is the result of what was generated, right? The multi-job that we defined, which contains all other jobs that we have generated before. Let's look at some most important part in multi-job C job, and they are, namely, you see that here in our loop we define the name for our job. Oh, let me go back. Also, we specify different parameters. As I mentioned before, this abort all other jobs flag is turned off. For example, it is turned on by default. So if you are doing this manually, you actually have to click it 60 times for 60 jobs, right? If you're adding these jobs and you don't want them to stop your execution. And also you may add some parameters to this multi-job. Okay? I never use this because I want my child jobs to be independent from any other jobs in my project, but it was just to prove the point. And also, like, you may say that, okay, all those jobs will be executed sequentially, and you will continue to the next phase always. It depends on what you want, right? Basically, you can define any parameter that you need. What's missing in our multi-job, right? First is a trigger. Basically, there are many types of triggers supported in Jenkins, as you know, and they all can be defined in your DSL. But for our job, what we have chosen is the folder content trigger, right? What it does, it observes some folder. This is important thing like cron tab specification, which we have a look at later. And here it is. So basically it will be similar for other triggers. I mean, it supports the same format. And there are different parameters that we define for our trigger here. You may use your own if you need it. For example, some SCM observer or something. And also result publisher. It's also supported by Jenkins Job DSL, as you might have guessed. In my case, we just use the XUnit, right? But you can do whatever you need. Of course, in very concise way, you can define the parameters for your JUnit. If you have a look at this code here, you may notice that it's really easy to read. You don't need to know anything about this DSL to understand what it does, right? And last but not least, if you have a look at all those jobs that we generated or created, it's a little bit messy, right? So you see that we have our child job here, our C job here. Do they belong to the same view? Do they belong to the same folder? So you have like, or you may have like 100 something similar jobs in one view, and it not very pleasant, right? Not very beautiful to look at, right? So also you may use Jenkins Job DSL to organize your jobs better. For example, you may easily create a separate folder here, which is pretty much straightforward. Here is the name of your folder. This is how it looks, how it is displayed, right? And the description. And also, there is more sophisticated way, but really beautiful, I think, is that they create separate list view. So as you can see here, you define a list view. And in this list view, you may specify, okay, these are the jobs that I want to be present in this list view. Okay? You may filter all this job let's say you want only stables one, and define all the columns in this table. You may say, okay, just show me the name or status or whatever. So what did we achieve by using Jenkins Job DSL? First, we can isolate particular configuration failure. Now every job is separated from other jobs. So if you, after your tests executed, navigate to this failure, you can see, okay, this is the configuration that failed. This is the history of this configuration execution. And basically all the logs in this job, they belong to this particular configuration. Okay. Next, the execution history is separated for each job. So you may follow the trends unless you are using some external servers that actually collect this information and present this information for you. You may just use Jenkins tools to examine the trends or some historical data. And also, if you have a look at this configuration, you can see that you can easily modify job steps or configuration or add new parameter just by modifying it in your template job. For example, we want to add new parameter here. We just update the steps. And for example, as I mentioned before, I used Python 2.7 and now it's Python 3 runner, right? So it's only the one place when you need to change it. You don't need to click through 100 jobs. You just change it in one place and it works. Yeah. Moreover, what's very useful thing is that if you update these steps, you regenerate your child jobs, right? The history of job execution is preserved, right? So you can still look at the logs and look what trends were for this job, right? And last thing is that, for example, if anything happens to our Jenkins host or to the, like, something bad, right? For example, lightning strikes it and it's down. You can regenerate all your jobs. You can recover all your jobs without any effort, right? You just get your files, get your scripts from your SCM, right? So let's summarize it now. Okay, I'm on time. So what are the advantages of the approach, right? First and foremost, you have configuration as code, right? So you can leverage the version control system. It's easier and faster to update your jobs, and it's easier to track jobs configuration changes and fixes, right? And probably it's the easiest way to control multiple related jobs, right? So if, as I showed you, like there is some multi-job that controls other jobs, you can easily assemble it together, right? And I think it's much more pleasant and fun just clicking your GUI over and over again and less error prone, right? And if we have advantages, there are some drawbacks. What are the drawbacks? And actually, I don't see any drawbacks to this approach because it's really simple and people without any programming experience can use this, except some really strange, groovy error messages that sometimes you'll get, something like that. But you'll get used to it. It's still easier than just understanding why your GUI configuration doesn't work. Okay, and when you install your Jenkins DSL plugin, there is a configuration. The documentation for it is available right away. I hope it should be a video here. Oh yeah, so if you go to any of your C jobs, you'll see there is a reference to the documentation, which is basically installed on your host. It's not online documentation, it's something the latest version of the documentation, which is really helpful, and there are so many examples there, so you can just follow the examples to make your job done, right? And the other thing, and it's really helpful, is Jenkins Job DSL Playground. Here is the link to it, and there what you can do, you can just post your DSL code here and verify if it works, right? If there are any issues there. Here we have an issue because I didn't define multi-job parameter properly. Proper line, okay, there are no string parameters in multi-job. Now you do run, and this is basically what Jenkins Job DSL does. It generates an XML for you, XML file that will be used by Jenkins to define your job, right? So it's time for question and answers. I hope you have some.
Thank you very much, Oleksandr, for your interesting presentation.
Thank you.